Yeah, and like after 6 when it is the last session.
Okay. Bye.
Yeah.
So, I hope you all had a nice coffee break. Thank you for being here. I'm not supposed to be its session chair right now, so I should have come up with a joke by now. And then Eike stole my joke about the State of the Union, and Arjen doesn't want me to introduce it as the State of the Union, so I'll just leave the rest of the introduction to Arjen.
That's fine. Hello, my name is Arjen Hiemstra. I am here to talk about a project that I've called Union, which I hope will become the future of everything styling within KDE and maybe even more than KDE. So what I will start with, though, is some pictures. So most of you will probably have seen some of these things. I'll start with, this is Kate, probably familiar. This is Plasma, also quite familiar to most of you. We have NeoChat, might be less familiar to people, but will still be familiar to a lot of you here. And then we have an application called KClock, which isn't all that familiar to most people, but still also a KDE application. So that's all great. We have 4 applications that look quite similar. So what's the problem here? Well, we have 4 applications and we have 4 different implementations of the Breeze style. We have Kate using QtWidgets, using Breeze. We have Plasma using Plasma style, using SVGs to supply that information. And then we have QtQuick, which in the case of NeoChat is its own special thing. And in the case of KClock, it actually uses a QtQuick-based implementation of the Breeze style. I hope that all of you recognize that having 4 different implementations of the same thing is already a problem. But sorry? Yeah, I'm intentionally didn't mention that one here, mostly because that's a whole different can of worms. But yes, you're right. There is a potential fifth in that we also have an implementation of Breeze for GTK. So apart from that issue of having 4 different implementations, there are also issues with the individual implementations. Starting off with the QtWidgets implementation, which is built using the C++ QStyle API, which is, to put it politely, not the greatest API for doing stuff with this. I actually put up some code from the Breeze style. Basically, you need to manually paint all the individual controls, and it's very painful to make any changes to how Breeze looks in QStyle. It takes a lot of time and effort and deep knowledge of how QStyle works. So this is really not that great. And similarly, an additional problem here is that it is limited by specifically those types of widgets that QStyle supports. So if you have a custom widget, which we don't all that much, but if you do have it, it also becomes quite hard to reuse the styling from QStyle. On the other hand, we have the QtQuick side, which is better. QtQuick is styled using QtQuick control, or QtQuick controls specifically is styled using QML files, which is already a lot easier to work with than QStyle, but it still has its issues, specifically one being if you make a mistake in your QtQuick style, you can break applications, which is dangerous when you want to include a custom style in, like, say, or inject a custom style in something like a Flatpak, which is a use case we do have. So to sort of get around this issue of having multiple implementations of the style, at some point we developed the QtQuick desktop style, which makes use of the widget style, QStyle, to render controls for QtQuick, which works. It means we have a bunch of things that don't require re-implementation. But it also comes with its drawbacks, because we're now limiting our QtQuick side by what the QStyle side supports, which isn't great. So it also comes with another drawback, because QStyle is software rendered, which means that on like mobile platforms, you now have an issue where the performance of this isn't great. So at some point, Noah Davis built a version of the Breeze style using pure QtQuick, because that was targeted to help make KDE applications work better on Plasma Mobile. And that it did, but it did mean we had yet another implementation of Breeze. And then finally we get back to Plasma, which has its own SVG-based system for styling, which is actually pretty decent to work with for non-developers. But even then, with them, when talking to them about it, it turned out, yeah, it's better to work with than, say, QtQuick, but it's still an issue because SVG is not a format designed for making UIs in. It's a graphics format meant for making images. It's still not great for doing UIs. It additionally also runs into the issue that you now need to render these SVGs, which comes with their own problems and performance penalties and everything. And additionally, the Plasma styling still misses the actual SVG files still miss a lot of information that is encoded in the QtQuick that's making use of this, to identify which elements to use and all those kinds of details. So I think you can all agree that we have a problem here. We actually, within the visual design group and some other areas, we've identified this problem a while back. And it's taken a while to get to get to a solution. But basically the question becomes, we have this problem, how do we move forward? How do we get to a next stage? So yeah, we need something new, because what we want to go to is the classic case of, hey, we now don't have 15 standards, or 5 in our case. We now have just the one, and just that one thing that we can use to build our UIs with. So just to work on, hey, what are we gonna do with this? I came up with some requirements during a long process of getting to where we are now. So the main point being, we need something where we have a single source of truth for all our styling. This is not, this is something that also our designers want, because they want to make changes to how things look. But right now, they are being blocked because we as developers say, hey, sorry, we like your ideas, but we just can't do this because it's going to take way too much effort and way too much work to make these changes. And in some cases, it's even saying, yeah, well, we can't technically do this here because we're being limited by, for example, Q style. So one of our, the main requirement is we need a single source of truth, but we also need to make sure that that single source of truth is easy to change, and easy to change for people who are not necessarily developers, because we want to be able to work with our designers to make it easier for them to implement their vision of how things should look. On the other hand, I also have some requirements, and those come from my side, from the technical side, because I want to make, if I'm going to work on this, if I'm going to build something for this, I want to make sure that I can build something that is optimized for our target. So if I'm building something and I want to target QtQuick, I want to have something that uses QtQuick hardware acceleration to render. If I'm using it in, I don't know, if we're going to use it in a crazy idea in a game engine using Vulkan, I want it to be able to use Vulkan internally. So that's one of the things. The other requirement is that single source of truth should not have any logic. And this is a technical requirement from my side, because if we don't have logic in there, it means that we can do lots more optimization on the library side with this on this input format, so that we can do more intelligent caching that doesn't need things like, oh, hey, state change, so I need to call back into whatever gives me this information. It needs to ask that to re-render something. No, you can just say, okay, state change here, have this different thing. It needs to be flexible enough that we can define custom types, because within KDE, we have the Kirigami library, which implements a whole bunch of custom controls on top of QtQuick, and they are all styled like Breeze. And there is no way for you, or well, there is a way, but there is practically almost no way for you to restyle those into a different style. So if you go and use a Kirigami application under GNOME, it will look like Breeze, at least partially. So with those requirements listed, let's look at how I got to where we are currently. So at some point while working on this entire thing, which has been a long process, I came up with this idea: what if we separate things? What if we say, hey, we have a some kind of definition that defines how things should look, and then we have an intermediate layer where that where that input format can get transformed into that intermediate layer, and then we have an output format that consumes that intermediate layer instead of the input format. The main difference this makes is that if something needs to change, if we want a different input format or whatever, we don't need to change the output format. If we want to add a different output format, we don't need to bother with the input format. So that was my idea that I had at some point. And I basically came up with, hey, could we use this to build something where we use CSS as an input format? Read a CSS file, read some definitions from that CSS file, and use that to style both a QtQuick application and a QtWidgets application. So I built a proof of concept of that a few years back at this point, proving that, hey, yeah, maybe we can actually do this. So I built this using a CSS parser that I found somewhere on the internet, which is its own issue. I'll get into that a bit later. And it built this very minimal intermediate layer that this CSS got converted into, and then built a QtQuick style using some of our standard stuff, but using the information that came out of this intermediate layer to render a button that looks somewhat like how Breeze would style it. And then on the other side, I built a Q style that used that same information and then did the same thing and ended up rendering a button that looked mostly the same to the QtQuick side. There's some bits that are not entirely the same, but was mostly because I ended up not wanting to spend that extreme amounts of time to get that rendering right. So what can we learn? What could we learn from that proof of concept? Well, most importantly, the core of my idea seemed like it would work and it would be possible to have something where we have a single input format and 2 or more output formats. Of course, it also means that, hey, yeah, okay, so we have this, but it means that we're basically going to need to rewrite the entire set of how we do our styling within KDE, which is going to be a lot of work. Yeah. And also something from the proof of concept. As I mentioned, it was using CSS. CSS is a problem mainly because there are no good CSS parsers out on the internet, at least not for what I want to do here. Like there are plenty of CSS, there's plenty of CSS parsers around, like in web browsers and stuff, but none of them are available as a C++ library where I can get a parsed tree of what's in a CSS file. Because most of them go like, oh yeah, here have a styled thing already, or stuff like that. And because, as I mentioned, it's all going to be a lot of work. So we need some way of splitting up this thing, because rather than building this monolith somewhere in a dark corner of KDE, and then at some point going, look, here is my thing, it's done and it's going to be awesome, and then real world hits it and it turns out to shatter that entire monolith. We need to be able to do this in a more step-by-step way, so that we can prove parts of the implementation are correct. So this proof of concept was done, I think I presented it to people during Academy 2022. And then it kind of didn't go anywhere because of various reasons. But I did mostly because I didn't have the time for it. I did spend on occasion some time on hey, okay, let's make a production version of this. How do I go about this? And this is how the project that I now call Union came about. And it's meant to become this single source of truth styling engine that we can use to get our styling into a shape where our designers aren't running away screaming. So how again, I get back to how do we go about this? At some point, when we were discussing this, a fairly smart guy who you may have heard about, called David Edmondson, suggested, "Hey, what about doing it as? What about just re-implementing the way Plasma is styled using this engine?" So that we know what the input format is, we know what the output format is, and we have a way of a thing where we can focus on that intermediate layer, because a lot of stuff depends on that intermediate layer, and if that intermediate layer sucks, then the entire thing will suck. So that's basically what I've been doing for the past several months, because finally we found someone came with, "Hey, I also want this. Also, I'm going to give you guys some money for this." So now I suddenly do have the time as part of my day job to work on this. So it's finally making progress, luckily. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like this. The left two buttons are being rendered by Union, are using styling from Union. The right two buttons are using styling from Plasma. It doesn't look well, apart from the icon, ignore that. It doesn't look any different at the moment, which is exactly the intention, because right now what we are trying to do is recreate Plasma styling, because that's what now we know what that needs to look like. So we need to come up with all the constructs to make sure that with that separation of concerns about having the inputs layer, which now reads Plasma SVG, that converts all that into this intermediate layer, and then goes into a separate QtQuick style that makes use of that intermediate layer and puts out something that actually looks like what Plasma does. So some implementation details about that. We now have a core library that basically is built around a concept of a theme, where a theme has a collection of style rules. And a style rule is, well, I'll get into that in a moment, but it has a collection of style rules and selectors. And then we have an input plugins, currently only one that reads Plasma SVGs and converts that into a bunch of style rules. And then we have an QtQuick style implementation that feeds information into the theme, and with that information selects which of those style rules apply to the current thing that it's trying to render. So style rules, I mentioned that. Style rules are which properties do apply to this element. That's the most generic description I can give you of this. And importantly as well, style rules have a selector. That selector determines what kind of elements this style rule applies to. So you can have something that says, "Hey, my text color should be red, and this should apply to any button." Or and if we have a button that is currently focused, rather than using red, it should become blue. These kind of things are encoded using the style rules, and they are effectively, they form a stack where the topmost property is read first, and if there's no value in the current style rule for that, the next one is used, etc. For those who have experience with CSS, this may sound very familiar. That is kind of intentional, partly because I was inspired by CSS, and partly because I still want to be able to use CSS eventually, but that's also a thing I get into. Sorry, how much time is left? 50 minutes. Okay. So that's the current state. What's next? I want to finish up this plasma style thing and basically get that into a state where we can say, hey, we deprecate plasma controls, the plasma specific implementation of the styling, and use union instead, so that we can get some real world testing of this. We need to implement the QtWidget side, which is going to be its own dragon to slay. And we need to decide on a new input format, because SVG is not meant as the final input format. As I said before, I still really would like to use CSS, but that's tricky with library things. There might be a solution in using a Rust CSS parser, but yeah, that's still in the investigative state. We also need to do a bunch of application integration, because Union assumes that a bunch of the information comes from the application next to what the style can already provide. But as a simple example, we have this header area in our applications. With Union, my intent is that the application will provide us information about what is defined as its header area. And there are some other things. We have a bunch of things where we use styling, breeze-like styling, and as well, mentioned here, GTK is a thing where we currently have a custom CSS. We might be able to use this to generate a CSS style. But that depends also on whether that GTK styling is actually maintainable, because from the GTK side, there's a lot of push about, hey, don't theme my apps and all that stuff. So with that, I come to the end and would say, any questions?
All right. So specifically, when it comes to plasma styling, you also mentioned this. So we have these SVGs with a bunch of elements that have pre-established names.
Yeah.
The code on the plasma side knows how to use them. Right? That's the component. Can you walk me through where does that match up happen in the SV implementation? Because you mentioned the output plugin that we currently have is just generic QtQuick one.
Yeah.
But where's the sort of plasma knowledge?
That's on the inputs plugin side. So in the case of Plasma SVG, we actually have 2 layers there, because we have a bunch of definitions in YAML that define which elements should be used for certain controls.
Okay.
So could you explain how your work on this has any implications about using a like QtQuick in a desktop environment that is not Plasma?
So the intent is eventually that we can have different input styles that implement platform-specific styles. So rather than having to rely on a bunch of different elements coming from different styles, we have a single source of truth that might be Breeze, but it also might be a Windows-specific thing, or a GTK-specific thing, or whatever. Or and I've not mentioned this intentionally, but if someone wants to go and do third-party a third-party theme, they can style the entire. The intention, at least, is that they can style the entire Plasma desktop using their own custom theme.
Have you looked into the integration with the Qt palette and the palette configurations for Qt application together with this? Because Qt application can also provide their own styling information using the palette.
Yeah, right now it doesn't do that because the plasma styling doesn't do that. It is a thing that we will need to look into, especially for Qt widgets and Qt style. We do actually have some experience with this already on the with the Qt desktop style, QtQuick desktop style and things like that. We already do some integration with Qt palette. Unfortunately, it became harder with Qt 6 because Qt palette in QtQuick moved from being a Qt palette to a QtQuick palette. That's a different discussion, but yeah, that's definitely one of the things that we do intend to support.
Hello. It happens that we have a CSS style in Qt widgets, which I assume you have looked at. That includes a CSS parser and also a similar architecture around rules, from what I understood from you. One of the challenges we have with the CSS style or the style sheet style in Qt is, of course, that it tries to know which aspects of the UI you have styled using CSS versus where it should fall back to the default style. Do you plan to do something similar magic, or do you agree with me that by not having any kind of default behavior, everything is unstyled? If it's not explicitly styled, we just draw everything as dumb rectangles. We can remove a lot of that complexity.
So I agree with you in there that no, I am not planning on any fallback behavior there, or at least no low level like per properties fallback stuff. We might be able to do something with higher level fallbacks, but yeah, the intent is not to have complicated fallback mechanisms there.
On the topic of CSS as an input format, CSS is quite powerful with animations and logic constraints. How much do you actually want to support from that rather large feature set?
That's currently an open question. It's something that needs to be investigated when we're actually developing a CSS input format. I like animations are something that we will want to support simply because we want to be able to use that for Breeze stuff. But maybe not all the types of animation. I'm mostly thinking like transitions we would want to support, but maybe not completely free-form animations. And there's also things like media queries and stuff. What do you do with that? Advanced selectors are, yeah, you're completely right. CSS, especially like what's becoming CSS4, is quite complex and large, and we'll have to see how what we can support, what needs to be supported.
You mentioned something about custom controls. How do you currently do that in using QtQuick style? Because you need to provide this template for all the controls that we currently support. So what is your solution for these custom ones?
So as I mentioned, currently the solution is that we style them as Breeze. And we don't, there is on the Kirigami side, we do have a construct where we do support like having a template where that you can re-implement, but in practice, basically almost no one does that because it's just a lot of work and ends up being very complex. So the end result is basically that we always have Breeze-styled custom controls, unfortunately.
So
So, previously you said there would be like no fallback behavior, and yeah, I'm sure that makes sense. But would it be possible for like a user to say, "Oh, I want my theme to inherit from this other theme"? Like, let's say a user says, "I like most to breeze, but I want to change this bit."
Yes, that will be at least I do intend to support things like that. It will be up to the input format on how that works. Like with CSS, it might just end up being something like, hey, import breeze and in the CSS file, and then override some rules. But that it's one of those areas where I think it is up to the input format to determine the best solution.
Have you looked into the GTK CSS styling, if it's something like that can be used, so we at least get a bunch of themes for free automatically if you use the same CSS style?
Yeah, you're not the first one to mention that. I have looked at that and basically concluded that it's probably not feasible for us, unfortunately. Also partly because of current attitude of GTK developers towards this. So I am quite hesitant to go and reuse something where they say, no, this is ours and you must not touch this.
I was hoping to revive Advaita Qt, but sadly no.
While the implementation part is another story. For this architecture specifically, while GNOME and GTK sites is a little different on that. For this intermediate layer, would you consider contributions that cover more than the Qt for like other desktops like Cinnamon, etc., to make it from KDE into a more free desktop thing? Possibly.
I mean, if there's interest there, yes, I would definitely consider them. I am open to like have this integrated in more layers, also to make it easier to run KDE stuff on Cinnamon or something. So I would totally be open to that. We need to figure out what the right place for such things would be.
So in my mind, I'm kind of getting hung up on the details. On the notion of custom controls, I'm curious if you can give a little hint at how you plan for that intermediary layer to be extensible. Because you mentioned one of your requirements is that the input side should be logic free. But in your re-implementation, that's currently not the case, right? Because you have the input plugin reading the SVG, doing the magic translation of this should be a task manager button. These are the element names to the intermediary thing. But in your future input format, the input would be more generic. So how do you transport the notion that there is not just a button, but there's also a specialization, which is, let's say, a task manager button, which doesn't occur anywhere else into that? Like, how do you extend that? I'm curious about that.
So I'll correct you on one thing. The input format, the format needs to be logic free. It's not the plugin that needs to be logic free.
You don't consider the plugin to be the
No, the plugin is the thing that translates the input format into the intermediate format.
Okay.
Yeah, and I run out of time. I'll
that
gladly
already
talk
answers
about
a lot.
it
So
in detail
yeah,
with
thank you.
But then I can actually show you some code.
That was very great. Thank you.